A father barely able to pay the rent, a piece of toast cut into 4 pieces, an unknown old woman at the end of the hall, a plate of carefully cut toast every day without fail. What that single father discovered after the last breakfast they shared wasn't just a farewell. It was a carefully crafted secret to reward the kind of kindness that does not appear in any photograph. A secret that would have died with her if, on the day the will was read, his name hadn't echoed among heirs to unimaginable fortunes. This is the story of how a man who was afraid even of his own voice had to lead an empire or watch his neighborhood be wiped off the map. Imagine this. Every morning, a tired single father cuts his toast into tiny triangles. Not because he's fancy, but because when you cut something small, it looks like more. He's trying to stretch breakfast for his 13-year-old son on $32 until Friday. But what if that one small habit, the way he cuts that toast, was being watched? What if a lonely old woman behind the peeling green door was testing him without him knowing? And what if, weeks later, after she dies, a team of lawyers and bodyguards show up at his diner, escorting him to a room full of billionaires where his name is called at the reading of a will? Because what she left him isn't just money. It's a secret, a choice, and a war. If someone knocked on your door tomorrow and told you that a stranger had rewritten their entire legacy around you, what would you do? If this story moves you, consider hitting like, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to believe that kindness still changes everything. Ethan Cole's alarm went off at 4:27 a.m. and he didn't hit snooze. He couldn't afford to. The apartment was small and cold, the kind of place where last night's pasta smell still clung to the curtains. His son Ben slept in the next room, 13 years old and too young to remember when breakfast wasn't rationed. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed its hollow answer. 3 eggs, half a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of white bread with 3 slices left. Ethan did the math in his head. 1 for Ben, 1 for Ben's lunch, 1 for himself, maybe. He sighed and plugged in the toaster. The smell of toasting bread filled the small space, warm and deceivingly hopeful. When the toast popped up, he reached for the cheap knife with the loose handle and did what he always did. He cut the slices corner to corner, then again, making small triangles. Tiny pieces looked like more, an old trick from harder times. He stacked 9 triangles on one plate for Ben, 3 on another for himself. Then he paused, staring at his dry toast. Without thinking too hard about it, he slid 6 more triangles off his plate and onto a paper one. 12 triangles. For someone else. He tucked the paper plate carefully into his messenger bag, grabbed the bundle of newspapers, and walked out into the cold Bronx morning. 3 flights down, out into streets still dark, garbage trucks groaning in the distance. He had 23 stops before 6:30 a.m. The 4th stop was always the same. Apartment 1G, the peeling green door with the tarnished brass number. By the time he pushed through the building's front door, she was already there. Margaret Hayes sat in a wooden chair just inside her doorway, propped open with a rubber wedge. White hair in a neat bun. Cream cardigan buttoned to the top. Sharp gray eyes that didn't match her age. "Good morning, Mr. Toast," she said, as she did every morning, a dry amusement in her voice. "Morning, Miss Margaret," Ethan answered, setting the paper plate in her thin hands. "You cut them smaller today," she observed, fingers trembling slightly. He tried to sound light. "Illusion of abundance," she smiled faintly. "Illusions can be dangerous, but sometimes they keep us alive long enough for reality to catch up." She said strange things like that. He'd learned not to overthink them. "How's your boy?" she asked. 13, Ethan said. "Still drawing. Still incredible at it. And you?" Her gaze sharpened. "Still not singing?" He forced a grin. "Just the shower. Fear is a clever thief, Ethan. It doesn't take everything at once." It sneaks in through ordinary days. He checked his watch. I should keep going. She hesitated, and something flickered in her expression. There will come a day when someone will ask you to stand in a room where you do not feel you belong. Promise me you won't run. He laughed awkwardly. That's oddly specific. Promise me. Okay, I promise. She nodded, satisfied. Good. He didn't know it would be the last promise he'd ever make to her. He'd made a lot of promises in his life. To his mother, that he'd take care of his sisters. To Lily, that they'd figure it out together. To Ben, every single night, that tomorrow would be better. Most of those promises had been kept through sheer stubbornness and luck. But this one, this strange, specific promise to an old woman in a hallway, felt different, heavier, like signing a contract he hadn't read yet. Years before Margaret called him Mr. Toast, Ethan Cole had been someone else. He'd grown up in Queens, the oldest of three, raised in a two-bedroom apartment where his mother sang soul songs while folding laundry and his father worked nights as a hospital janitor. Money had always been tight, but music had been loud. At 15, Ethan had stepped onto a stage for the first time at a community talent show. The lights had blinded him, but when the first notes came out, fear had slid away on a wave of sound. People stood, clapped, shouted his name. A teacher had pulled him aside afterward. You know you could do this. For real. Conservatory. Scholarships. He'd laughed, embarrassed. People like me don't get that. People like you? She'd repeated. Talented, hungry, working class? Those are the kids who work hardest. She'd helped him apply. He'd auditioned for the New York Conservatory of Music in a room that smelled of coffee and hope. He'd sung like his life depended on it. For a few weeks, it had looked like a door might really open. An acceptance letter. A scholarship covering 70% of tuition. His parents proud, worried faces. Then, 3 weeks before he was supposed to start, his father collapsed at work. Heart attack, 51 years old. The conservatory extended his admission for a year. Take the time you need, they'd written. But bills didn't wait. His mother's grief turned into exhaustion. Ethan took a warehouse job. Then a second one at a diner. 1 year turned into 2, then 3. The acceptance letter yellowed on his wall. The dream calcified into something he stopped mentioning. By 24, he'd met Lily, a nursing student with quick hands and a laugh that made up for everything. They'd fallen in love in the cracks between shifts. When she got pregnant, they'd cried, fear and joy tangled together. Ben had been born at 3:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. Ethan had sung to him in the hospital room, voice raw with awe. You missed your calling, a nurse had said. He'd smiled, but something in his eyes had dimmed. My calling's right here. Life had been beautiful and hard. Then, 3 weeks after Ben's 8th birthday, Lily's car had been hit by a truck that ran a red light. The next months blurred. Grief and logistics collided. Somewhere in there, Ethan had taken the delivery job. Early mornings, done by noon, gave him afternoons for school pickups. Years later, he was still setting his alarm for 4:27, still cutting toast into triangles. The acceptance letter from the conservatory sat folded in a box under his bed, along with a faded photo of him and Lily in front of a karaoke machine, laughing. Sometimes when Ben looked up from his drawings and said, Dad, you're actually good, something in Ethan's chest ached like a phantom limb. If you've ever buried a dream so deep you convinced yourself it was dead, you know that ache. It's not quite grief. It's the ghost of what could have been, tapping on your ribs, whispering, remember me? Ethan had gotten good at ignoring it. He told himself he was being practical, responsible. A good father doesn't chase impossible things when his kid needs breakfast. But late at night, when Ben was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he'd hum old songs under his breath and wonder if practical was just another word for afraid. Margaret Hayes had lived a life most people never saw. She'd grown up poor, her father's hands stained with machine oil, her mother's dresses stitched together from scraps. Her younger brother Daniel had been full of jokes and stubbornness. At 23, he died in a construction accident, faulty safety protocols, a quiet settlement. Margaret had gone into finance with a fierceness that startled everyone. She'd built Hayes Capital from the ground up, investing in overlooked companies, buying buildings others wanted to tear down. She'd walked those hallways herself in the early years, listening to tenants' stories. But time and success had bought distance. Her son, Julian, had grown up in townhouses and private schools, more comfortable with staff and neighbors. They'd argued about money, legacy, what the company was for. "You throw away profits on charity projects," he'd said once. "We could be doubling our capital. And you think doubling our capital will bring back your uncle?" She'd snapped. He'd grown into a man who loved control and the admiration of powerful men. Then, in his early 30s, he died in a car accident, a rainy road. A drunk driver. She'd buried a second generation of men she loved. After his funeral, sitting alone in her townhouse surrounded by awards and stock certificates, she'd asked herself, what was it all for? Her lawyers had suggested leaving everything to charity or distant relatives. She'd nodded, tired, not fully caring. But then, because grief doesn't stay in its lane, she'd started walking again. Not in Central Park, but in the neighborhoods where her buildings still stood. She'd pulled a plain coat over her expensive sweaters and sat in hallways, waiting for newspapers. That's when she'd seen him. A man with tired shoulders and kind eyes, carrying too many papers and a plate of toast cut into triangles. When she'd said, "You cut that like a mother hiding how little there is," he'd stopped, looked embarrassed. Then laughed, a laugh with sadness in it. The next day, he'd brought her toast. For months, she'd watched. How he never rushed her. How he carried Mrs. Lopez's groceries. How he hummed under his breath, a voice too good for hallways. One morning, Ben had burst in with a sketchbook. "Dad, you forgot your lunch." Margaret had watched them together and felt something click. Over the next weeks, as Ethan kept bringing toast and kindness, a question had grown in her mind. What if, instead of letting lawyers decide what her life's work became, she chose someone who reminded her of what it had all been for? Someone who knew what it meant to lose, to work, to love quietly. She'd called her lawyers back. "We're changing everything. Now, sitting in that hallway, her hands trembling more often, her breath shorter, she knew she was running out of time. That's why she'd made him promise. Margaret had made many calculated risks in her life. She'd bet on failing companies that became empires. She'd held on to buildings when everyone told her to sell. But this, choosing a stranger, a tired delivery man with calloused hands and a voice he refused to use, this was her biggest gamble. And she knew it. Some nights, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, she'd wondered if she was being sentimental. Foolish. But then she'd remember the way he'd cut that toast, the care in it, the quiet generosity. And she'd think, if the world is going to be shaped by anyone, let it be shaped by people who still know how to share. The next morning, Ethan reached the green door at 5:10 a.m. It was closed. He knocked gently. "Ms. Margaret?" No answer. 2 days passed. Her door stayed shut. On the third day, a white strip of paper was taped to it. Management office. Contact immediately. His stomach dropped. He called the building manager. "Hi, this is Ethan, the paper delivery guy. I'm calling about Ms. Hayes in 1G. "Yeah, she passed away," the man interrupted. "Couple nights ago." "Heart or something?" The words hit him like a dropped box. "What? When?" "Ambulance came. We're sorting paperwork. You family?" "No, I just ... Ethan looked at the abandoned plate of toast. "I just brought her paper." "Well, you don't gotta bring it anymore." The line clicked dead. Ethan stood there, the hallway suddenly colder. He bent and picked up the plate of toast, throat tight. He carried it to the roof and sat on a milk crate, staring at the gray sky. "You left without saying goodbye," he muttered. He could almost hear her retort. "Death rarely schedules courtesy visits, Mr. Cole." He ate the toast slowly, as if that honored her. Then he went back to work. He still had 19 stops. He still had rent. Life, as always, pushed forward. That's the cruel efficiency of cities, isn't it? Someone vanishes, and the subway still runs. The deli still opens. Your alarm still goes off. Grief gets folded into the schedule between deliveries and bills. Ethan had learned that after Lily died, the world doesn't pause for your loss. It just makes a little more room in the silence and expects you to keep walking. So he did, one foot in front of the other, toast in triangles. Papers delivered. Another day survived, but something had shifted. That empty green door felt like an unanswered question now, and he hated unanswered questions. A week later, Ethan was sweeping under the counter at the diner when the bell jingled. Two people walked in, immediately out of place. A woman in a sharp navy suit. A man in gray with an earpiece. Behind them, an expensive car idled at the curb. "Are you Mr. Ethan Cole?" the woman asked. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Did something happen with Ben?" "Your son is fine," she said quickly. "My name is Lavra Chun. I'm an attorney with Walters and Pierce. This is Mr. Daniels with our security team. We're here on behalf of the estate of Mrs. Margaret Hayes." The name landed like a stone. "She named you in her will," Lavra said. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. "No, that has to be a mistake. I barely knew her. Be that as it may, your presence is required at the reading of her will. 4 p.m. today. Hayes Capital headquarters on Madison Avenue." "The what headquarters?" "Hayes Capital, Mrs. Hayes Company." "Company?" His mind reeled. She owned a company? Laura's eyebrow twitched. You didn't know who she was. She was just ... Ms. Margaret. For the first time, Lavra smiled. "Yes, she did like triangles." Mr. Daniels stepped forward. "We're here to escort you, sir. This is a high-profile estate. There may be media." "Media?" Ethan felt like he'd fallen into someone else's dream. "Look, there's got to be some mix-up." Lavra placed an envelope on the counter. His name was typed on it. "This is your formal notice, Mr. Cole. Mrs. Hayes was very clear that your attendance today was non-negotiable." He thought of the promise he'd made. "There will come a day when someone will ask you to stand in a room where you do not feel you belong. Promise me you won't run." His heart pounded. "What about my son?" "We've arranged for a car to pick him up and bring him to the building. With your permission." He stared at the embossed card in his hand. Somewhere between the empty refrigerator and this polished business card, a bridge had been built without his consent. Bridges are funny things. You don't always see them being built. One day you're standing on solid ground, and the next, you're halfway across a span you didn't design, heading toward a shore you can't quite see. And the only choice left is whether to keep walking or turn back. Ethan looked at the card in his hand, the embossed letters sharp under his thumb. This wasn't the life he'd planned. But then again, none of his life had gone to plan. Maybe that was the point. Maybe plans were just another way of pretending you had control. "Okay," he said slowly. "I'll come." By 3:10 p.m., Ethan stood outside the diner in his best shirt, pale blue, worn at the collar, and black pants shiny at the knees. The black car pulled up. Lavra sat inside with a tablet. Mr. Daniels scanned the sidewalk. "Right on time," Lavra said. As the car pulled away, the city changed around them. Bodegas turned into boutiques. Graffiti gave way to glass. They stopped in front of a sleek building. Hayes Capital. Ethan stared. "That's her name?" "Yes." Inside, marble floors reflected light like water. A reception desk carved from stone. flower arrangements that cost more than his grocery bill. "This way, Mr. Cole," Mr. Daniels said. They passed security, entered an elevator. Ethan caught his reflection next to Laura's. His shirt didn't sit right. A faint stain from Ben's chocolate fingers ghosted his sleeve. "Breathe," Laura said quietly. "I am. Try again." The elevator chimed. 28th floor. At the end of the hall, double glass doors. Through them, people in suits, pearls, polished shoes. His palms began to sweat. "Your son is in conference room B," Laura said. "Do you want to see him first?" He hesitated. Part of him wanted to run. Another part remembered Margaret's eyes. "No," he said. "If I see him, I might chicken out." "Let's do this." Laura's gaze held respect. "Just remember, you're here because someone chose you, not as a favor." As a decision, they pushed open the doors. Every face turned. Around a long table sat a dozen people. Men in custom suits. Women in dresses that didn't wrinkle. At the head sat a man in his 50s with perfect silver hair and a watch that flashed when he moved. "Who is this?" he asked. "The caterer?" "This is Mr. Ethan Cole," Laura said. As indicated in Mrs. Hayes' will, the room shifted. "The paper boy?" A younger man scoffed. "You're kidding." Ethan sat in an empty chair halfway down the table, acutely aware of every scuff on his shoes. At the far end, an older woman with gray hair and glasses opened a leather binder. "I am Evelyn Monroe," she said, "executor of Mrs. Hayes' estate. Present are her niece, Mrs. Carolyn Langford, her nephew-in-law, Mr. Richard Langford, their son Tyler, and, as per Mrs. Hayes' instructions, Mr. Ethan Cole." She began to read. "Personal effects. Donations. A scholarship fund." The Langfords' faces tightened at each mention of something not going to them. Then Evelyn's tone shifted. "And now to matters regarding the majority stake of Hayes Capital." The room stilled. "Prior to 6 months ago," Evelyn continued, "controlling shares were set to pass jointly to the Langfords. However, Mrs. Hayes reconsidered this arrangement." "What?" Caroline demanded. "On what grounds?" "She left a letter," Evelyn said, producing an envelope. She began to read Margaret's words. "My dearest Caroline, and Richard and Tyler, if you are hearing this, I have died." "Richard, unclench your jaw." Some people laughed. The letter explained how Margaret had built Hayes Capital in memory of her brother. How she'd tried to honor his death by refusing cruelty. How Julian hadn't understood. How she'd spent years after his death watching her family and realizing they saw people as decimal points. "In one building, I met someone who reminded me of my father, my brother, and the young woman I used to be. He brought me toast." There was a murmur. Ethan's face flushed. "He did not know who I was. He did not treat me differently. He brought me toast because I looked like I needed it, and because he had very little and was still willing to share. I realized that if I left Hayes Capital in the hands of those who saw it merely as profit, then my life's work would be reduced to numbers. And so I rewrote my will." Evelyn turned a page. "In summary," she said, "Mrs. Hayes has transferred her controlling 51% stake in Hayes Capital into the Hayes Legacy Trust. The trustee is Mr. Ethan Cole." The air left the room. "What?" Ethan croaked. "That can't be right." "It is a legal entity that holds assets," Evelyn explained. "You will have significant authority to direct how Hayes Capital votes on major decisions, approve or block projects, and influence the company's mission." Richard's face went red. "You're telling me this delivery man gets to decide what happens to billions?" "It is not your company, Richard," Evelyn said. "It is, and always has been, Margaret's." "This is insane," Tyler muttered. "No offense, but what do you know about any of this?" "None taken," Ethan said hoarsely. "You're right. I don't know anything. I shouldn't be here." "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Evelyn said sharply. He obeyed. "You can decline," Richard said quickly. Take the consolation prize. Some cash. Walk away. Leave the heavy lifting to those who understand it, Evelyn interjected. If Mr. Cole declines, he forfeits all direct benefits. He would receive a modest fixed amount, $200,000. Ethan's breath caught. Take the miracle, Richard said. This is a fantasy, a liability. You'll be torn apart. Ethan closed his eyes. 2 paths. On one, safety. A nicer apartment. No more red notices. No boardrooms. No enemies. On the other, a blur. Contracts. Mistakes. People trying to outmaneuver him. But also, the faces in Margaret's building. Mrs. Lopez. The kids in the courtyard. What did she want me to actually do? He asked. Evelyn outlined the directives. Maintain affordable housing. Fund scholarships for underprivileged youth in music and art. Prohibit speculative development that displaced communities. Ethan looked down at his hands. Calluses, small burns. Hands that had held his son when he was scared. I've spent my whole life letting fear make my choices, he said quietly. Fear took music from me, took dreams. I don't want to let it take this. Especially if saying yes could mean keeping people in their homes, giving kids like my son a chance. His voice shook. He didn't care. So no, I won't sign it away. I'll take the trust, the job. I'll learn. I'll probably screw up. But I'm not walking away because I'm scared. Richard's mouth opened, closed. Evelyn nodded, a tiny smile at the corner of her mouth. For the record, she said, Mr. Ethan Cole accepts the role of trustee. You're making a huge mistake, Richard said, voice low and dangerous. Possibly, Ethan said, but it's my mistake to make. In the months that followed, Ethan stepped into a world that didn't soften itself. His days changed. He woke at 4:27 a.m. out of habit, then slowly allowed himself to sleep until 7. He hired advisors, read binders late into the night, learned terms like fiduciary duty and return on investment. The Langfords hired lawyers, challenged clauses. The media ran headlines. Billionaire leaves empire to ... her paperboy? Inside the company, the board split. Some saw him as a threat. Others, quieter, saw him as an ally in steering back toward Margaret's principles. He found people he could trust. Daniel Ortiz, a senior project manager. Priya, a financial analyst who'd grown up in housing projects. Evelyn. They became his found family. 3 months later, a major proposal landed on the board's table. A redevelopment plan for 3 aging buildings in Brooklyn. Tear them down. Build luxury condos. Projected profit, astronomical. Casualties, over 100 low-income families. The relocation packages are generous, an executive said. Moving stipends. A month of rent somewhere else. The upside is massive. Ethan flipped through the pages, stopping at the section listing current occupants, names, family sizes, estimated incomes. A note in the margin, potential PR risk if not handled delicately. So we're buying their silence along with their homes, he said quietly. It's called doing business in the real world, the executive replied. With all due respect, Mr. Cole, you deliver newspapers. I don't deliver newspapers anymore, Ethan said. And I'm voting no. The room erupted. Richard leaned forward. You can't just veto a project because of your feelings. This is a business. And part of my job, Ethan said, his voice steady, is to make sure this business doesn't forget what it's for. He looked around the table. Margaret built this company in memory of her brother, who died because people in nicer suits decided safety costs were optional. She told me, in her letter, that if I forgot where I came from, this responsibility would break me. I'm not going to let that happen. He stood. Here's what we're going to do instead, he said. We're going to renovate those buildings, upgrade them. Keep the tenants in place. Subsidize the difference with profits from other projects. And we're going to prove that you can make money and still let people keep their homes. That's naive, Richard scoffed. Maybe, Ethan said, but it's what she wanted. And it's what I'm choosing. The vote was called. To everyone's shock, several board members sided with him. The redevelopment plan was rejected. Richard stormed out. But Ethan stayed. Staying is its own kind of bravery. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with music or slow motion moments. It's showing up again the next day, even when every cell in your body says run. It's sitting in rooms where you don't speak the language yet and refusing to let that silence mean surrender. Ethan didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a guy who'd made a promise to a woman who'd seen something in him he still wasn't sure existed. But he'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you don't believe in yourself until after you've already done the thing. So he stayed. And slowly, day by day, the room started to feel a little less foreign. The language started to make a little more sense. And the man who used to cut toast into triangles to make scarcity look like abundance began to understand that maybe, just maybe, he'd been training for this all along. Months turned into a year. Ethan moved Ben into a better apartment. Not a mansion, just a place with heat that worked and a window that let in light. He enrolled Ben in an art program funded by the very scholarship Margaret had established. One evening, as Ben sketched at the kitchen table, Ethan sat across from him with a cup of coffee and a worn leather journal he'd found in Margaret's personal effects, left to him in a small locked box. Inside, in her handwriting, were notes. About her brother, about Julian, about regrets and hopes. On the last page, she'd written, "If you're reading this, Ethan, it means you didn't run. I knew you wouldn't. Not because you're fearless, but because you understand that love, for your son, for strangers, for a dream you think is dead, is stronger than fear. Don't let them make you forget that. Teach your boy that talent is a gift, but character is a decision. And when the sharks circle, remember, even sharks fear the deep. Build something beautiful." Ethan closed the journal, throat tight. "Dad?" Ben looked up. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ethan said, voice rough. "Yeah, I'm okay." "You look like you're thinking about something big." Ethan smiled. "I was thinking, maybe it's time I started singing again. For real, not just in the shower." Ben's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Really." A year later, Ethan stood in the refurbished community center in one of Hayes Capital's buildings, the same buildings the Langfords had wanted to demolish. The space was filled with families, kids, musicians, artists. A mural covered one wall, painted by Ben and a group of teenagers from the scholarship program. In the corner, a small stage had been set up for an open mic night. Ethan stepped onto it, a borrowed guitar in his hands, his heart pounding the way it had decades ago at that first talent show. The lights were bright. The crowd quieted. He thought of his father, his mother's songs, Lily's laughter, Margaret's sharp gray eyes, and then he sang. His voice, rough and warm and human, filled the room. People stood, clapped, some cried. When he finished, Ben was in the front row, tears streaming down his face, grinning. "That was incredible, Dad," he said when Ethan stepped down. "Thanks, champ," Ethan said, pulling him into a hug. "Do you think Ms. Margaret would have liked it?" Ben asked. Ethan looked around the room, at the families, the art, the light. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think she would have loved it, because sometimes a single act of quiet kindness, like cutting toast into small triangles for a lonely old woman, can unlock the kind of treasure only a good heart deserves. Not just money, not just power, but the chance to build something that lasts, to teach a son that character matters more than comfort, to prove that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you lift up along the way." And when Ethan walked out of that community center that night, Ben's hand in his, The stars bright above the Bronx, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not exhaustion, hope. Who are the invisible, kind people in your life? And what would happen if you treated every small kindness like it mattered? If this story reminded you that goodness still counts, share it. Let someone else remember that even in a world obsessed with power and profit, a single repeated act of love can still change everything.